Glasses clink, laughter fills the room, and golden balloons bob above the heads of friends and family gathered to honor Charles's 70th birthday. Margaret stands quietly near the edge of the crowd, her smile poised and polite, but there is a flicker in her eyes, something unreadable, something sharp. She lifts a champagne flute, tapping it gently with a spoon. The clear, crisp ring slices through the hum of conversations, drawing all eyes to her. Charles, caught mid-laugh with Jenny at his side, turns toward Margaret, his grin faltering as he senses the shift in the air. Margaret raises her glass higher, her smile cool and deliberate. "To my husband," she begins, her voice carrying just enough warmth to deceive. "And to the woman who has been much more than just his nurse." A ripple of stunned silence washes over the room as Charles and Jenny freeze in place, their expressions shifting from confusion to panic. Margaret's eyes gleam, as if she's savoring this moment. She pauses briefly, the corners of her mouth curling ever so slightly. "And tonight," she adds softly, her tone turning ominous, "we'll see if every secret stays buried, or if this party ends with more than just broken hearts." The weight of her words hangs heavy in the air, and for the first time a chill spreads through the crowd. Jenny's hand drops from Charles's arm. A distant door creaks somewhere in the house, and in the silence that follows, it feels as if something darker has already begun to stir. Jenny was beautiful, charming, and far too comfortable around Charles. She hovered close to him, her laugh too familiar, her hand brushing his arm more often than necessary. Charles responded with warmth, his eyes lighting up every time she leaned in to whisper something in his ear. Margaret's smile never wavered, but her gaze was sharp, precise. She saw everything. For months she had known, every late night, every excuse, every lie. She had waited for the perfect moment, and tonight was that moment. This wasn't just a birthday party, it was a reckoning. At precisely the right time, Margaret stepped forward, champagne flute in hand. She tapped the side of her glass with a spoon, the clear ringing sound cutting through the conversations. One by one, the guests fell silent, their attention turning to her as she stood at the center of the room, poised and serene. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she began, her voice smooth and measured. "It means the world to Charles and to me to have all of you here to celebrate this special milestone." She smiled, letting her gaze sweep over the room before landing on Charles. 70 years, she continued, and 45 of them spent with me. A lifetime of memories, of joy, and, of course, of challenges. But tonight I wanted to give Charles a gift unlike any other. Charles chuckled softly, a hint of confusion flickering across his face. He raised his glass, ready to toast, but Margaret's next word stopped him cold. "To my husband," she said, her gaze locking onto Jenny, "and to the woman who has been so much more than just his nurse." The room froze. Glasses hovered mid-air, conversations stopped mid-sentence, and all eyes turned toward Charles and Jenny. Jenny's face went pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. Charles's expression crumbled into confusion, panic setting in as he realized that Margaret wasn't just making a joke. Margaret's smile remained steady, but her voice carried a new weight, one that hinted at years of betrayal, disappointment, and cold, calculated preparation. "Surprise," she whispered, her gaze fixed on Jenny, daring her to respond. The air thickened with awkward silence. Guests glanced at one another, unsure if they should intervene or look away from the slow-motion implosion happening before them. Jenny's face flushed, her hand trembling as she set her glass down. Charles shifted uncomfortably, realizing with growing dread that there was no way out of this confrontation. Margaret let the silence linger, savoring the tension. Her smile, polite but icy, remained intact as she stepped closer to her husband. "Charles, dear," she said softly, "don't look so surprised. You didn't think I'd let tonight pass without acknowledging everything you've shared with Jenny, did you?" Jenny stumbled backward a step, her expression a mixture of shock and shame. "Margaret, I think there's been a misunderstanding," she stammered, her voice brittle. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, though her voice stayed calm. "No, Jenny. No misunderstanding at all. Just clarity. Something you seem unfamiliar with." Charles opened his mouth to speak, but Margaret silenced him with a glance sharp enough to cut glass. "Please, Charles, we've all had enough of your stories." A few nervous coughs and whispers rippled through the crowd as guests shuffled uncomfortably, trying to process the unexpected turn. Some edged closer to the door, uncertain whether they should stay or politely escape the unfolding disaster. Jenny shook her head, as if trying to dismiss what was happening, but Margaret continued, her voice growing firmer with each word. "This affair of yours, did you think it would remain a private indulgence? Did you think I wouldn't notice the late nights, the secret calls? How small you must have thought of me." Charles lowered his gaze, the weight of his wife's words pressing down on him. He clenched his fists in his lap, his once proud demeanor now shattered under Margaret's unrelenting scrutiny. Jenny, caught in the center of the storm, could only stand in frozen humiliation. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, Margaret dropped her final blow. "But I suppose secrets have a way of coming to light, don't they?" she said, her tone sharper now. "And tonight is only the beginning." Before Charles could react, Margaret added, "After all, we wouldn't want to ruin the surprise for anyone, would we?" Her words were laced with something darker, something unsettling. The air grew heavier, the sense of unease deepening. Margaret tilted her head slightly, as if pondering something only she knew. "Perhaps it's time everyone saw things for what they really are." The way she said it made the hair on the back of Charles's neck stand on end. Then she smiled again, a calm, knowing smile that sent a chill through the room. And somewhere, in the back of the house, a door creaked open. The creak of the back door sent a ripple through the already stifled atmosphere, drawing every eye toward the darkened hallway at the far end of the room. Conversations ceased entirely, and a cold chill settled over the gathering as the guests stared, frozen in place. Margaret didn't flinch. She turned her head slowly toward the sound, her expression unreadable but deliberate, as if this moment had been expected. Charles followed her gaze, his body stiffening with unease. "Margaret," he whispered, his voice strained, "what did you do?" But Margaret remained silent, her gaze fixed on the hallway. Then it happened. A scream pierced the air, sharp and panicked, slicing through the tension like a knife. The guests jolted as one, turning toward the source of the sound. A woman, one of the guests, stumbled into the room from the hall, her hand clamped over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. There's someone in there," she gasped. "In the pantry. Oh my God, there's blood everywhere." The room erupted into chaos. People exchanged confused glances, trying to make sense of what they'd just heard. Margaret stood still, her expression composed, her hands folded calmly in front of her, as if the scene unfolding around her had no power to rattle her. Charles sprang to his feet, his pulse racing as dread surged through him. "Margaret!" he snapped, his voice rising with fear and disbelief. "What the hell is going on?" Margaret's gaze shifted to him, cold and distant. "It seems the night has taken an unexpected turn," she said softly, her tone devoid of emotion. A group of guests cautiously made their way toward the hallway, curiosity mingling with fear. Someone flicked on a light, and what they saw drew a collective gasp. Lying on the floor of the pantry was Jenny, Her lifeless body sprawled awkwardly across the tiles. Blood pooled beneath her, staining the floor in dark crimson. Her eyes were open, frozen in an expression of terror. Deep gashes marred her neck and wrists, the brutality of the act evident in every wound. Gasps and murmurs filled the room, horror spreading like wildfire through the stunned crowd. "Oh my God," someone whispered. "She's dead." Charles stumbled back a step, his face ashen, his mind reeling. He looked from the gruesome scene to Margaret, his heart pounding in his chest. You did this," he whispered, disbelief and horror filling his voice. Margaret arched an eyebrow, her expression as composed as ever. "Did I?" she said calmly, her voice a chilling contrast to the horror surrounding them. Charles's knees nearly buckled under the weight of his fear. "Why?" he rasped, struggling to comprehend the scene in front of him. Margaret stepped closer, her voice soft but laced with menace. "Some truths demand a heavier reckoning than words alone." The guests, too stunned to move, watched in helpless silence as the reality of the night's events unfolded before them. Charles was trapped, caught between the crumbling remnants of his life and the dark, cold presence of the woman who had orchestrated it all. And Margaret, serene and poised, stood amidst the chaos, calmly watching everything fall apart. The silence that followed Jenny's lifeless body was suffocating. The sight of her crumpled on the cold pantry floor, bathed in blood, left the guests paralyzed with fear. A few backed away, bumping into each other as they struggled to process what they were seeing. No one knew what to do: call for help, run, or confront the horrifying possibility standing right in front of them. Charles's mind reeled as he tried to connect the pieces, but none of it made sense. He stared at Margaret, his breath shallow, his heart hammering in his chest. She stood calmly in the middle of the room, her expression composed, almost serene. Too serene for a woman who had just uncovered her husband's affair and now stood in the wake of a brutal murder. "Margaret," Charles's voice cracked under the weight of disbelief. "What have you done?" Margaret's lips curved slightly, though it wasn't quite a smile. "What needed to be done?" she replied softly, her words deliberate, controlled. Charles staggered backward, horror washing over him. He glanced at the guests, but they were just as stunned, too frightened to speak or move. His eyes fell on Jenny's lifeless form again, and the overwhelming sense of dread began to tighten around him. He knew the affair had been a mistake, but this was beyond anything he could have imagined. "This wasn't the plan," Charles whispered, more to himself than anyone else. His mind raced, trying to untangle the madness that had suddenly consumed the night. Margaret stepped closer, her heels clicking softly against the floor. "You're right," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "It wasn't my plan. But plans have a way of changing, don't they, Charles? Just like promises." The accusation in her voice was subtle but sharp, cutting through the confusion like a knife. Charles could feel the eyes of every guest boring into him, their silent judgment weighing heavy. He could see it in their faces: questions, fear, disbelief. Could he have done this? Had Margaret taken things too far, or had she only exposed a deeper truth about him? "Don't you see?" Margaret continued, her voice smooth and deliberate. "This wasn't just about an affair. This was about trust. Something you discarded the moment you let her into our lives." She gestured toward Jenny's lifeless body, as if the dead woman were nothing more than a consequence, a byproduct of betrayal. "You think I did this?" Charles shot back, his voice cracking under the pressure. He glanced around the room, his hands raised in disbelief. "You think I killed her?" Margaret's gaze didn't falter. "Didn't you?" The simplicity of the question was chilling. It wasn't an accusation, it was a challenge for him to prove otherwise, to untangle himself from the web that Margaret had spun so masterfully. Charles shook his head violently, panic rising in his chest. "This is insane," he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. "You're setting me up. I didn't touch her." The guests murmured among themselves, their confusion only growing. Some seemed to believe him. Others glanced nervously at Margaret, whose composure remained unnervingly intact. Margaret tilted her head slightly, studying Charles as if he were a puzzle she had finally solved. "Charles, you've been lying for months," she said softly. "What makes this lie any different?" Her words stung more than any accusation could. They carried with them the weight of every deceit, every excuse, every betrayal he had thought he could hide. He took a step toward her, desperation in his voice. "Margaret, please, I swear I didn't do this. You have to believe me." She watched him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, finally, she sighed. A soft, weary sound, as if she were letting go of something heavy. "It doesn't matter what I believe, Charles," she said quietly. "What matters is what they believe." She gestured subtly toward the guests, who stood frozen, their faces a mixture of fear, suspicion, and unease. The realization hit Charles like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just Margaret he had to convince, it was everyone in that room. And in the absence of the truth, perception would become reality. The weight of her manipulation pressed down on him, suffocating in its brilliance. She had cornered him completely, and now, in the eyes of everyone present, he was no longer just an unfaithful husband. He was a potential murderer. "You set this up," Charles whispered, his voice filled with both awe and despair. "You knew exactly how this would look." Margaret didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached for her champagne flute, the faintest hint of a smile playing on her lips as she swirled the golden liquid inside. "Like I said," she murmured, "some truths require a heavier reckoning." Charles's mind raced, searching desperately for a way out, a way to prove his innocence. But every glance, every whisper, every flicker of doubt in the eyes of the guests reminded him that the narrative was no longer his to control. And Margaret, calm, composed, and utterly in command, stood at the center of it all, holding the story's final chapter in her hands. The weight of Margaret's last words lingered in the room, pressing down like a suffocating fog. Charles stood in stunned silence, trapped in a web woven so carefully that every movement he made seemed only to tighten the strands around him. The guests remained frozen, uncertain whether to intervene or distance themselves from the unfolding disaster. No one dared to leave, and no one dared to stay too close. They were witnesses now, unwilling participants in a nightmare. It wasn't long before the distant sound of sirens broke the eerie stillness, growing louder with each passing second. Someone must have called the police. Whether out of panic or duty, it didn't matter. The damage had already been done. Margaret, standing tall and composed, made no move to stop them. She simply waited, her expression unreadable, as the approaching sirens signaled the beginning of something far worse than a ruined birthday celebration. The flashing red and blue lights soon illuminated the windows, and moments later, the front door swung open. 2 officers entered, their hands resting on their holsters, scanning the room quickly before focusing on the horror inside. Their eyes landed on Jenny's lifeless body, sprawled awkwardly on the pantry floor, her blood staining the tiles beneath her. "Everyone stay where you are," one officer commanded, his voice firm but controlled. "Nobody leaves until we get some answers." Margaret remained still, her face a mask of calm. Charles, on the other hand, felt panic rise like bile in his throat. He knew how this looked, how everything, from the timing to the circumstances, painted him as guilty. And now, with the police involved, the stakes were higher than ever. One of the officers approached Jenny's body, crouching down to examine the scene. "It's bad," he murmured to his partner. "Multiple lacerations. Looks personal." The second officer turned to the guests, his gaze sharp. "Who found the body?" A woman in the back raised a shaky hand. I did," she stammered. "In the pantry. I just went in to get more wine, and—" Her voice broke, and she covered her mouth to hold back a sob. The officer nodded curtly. "And who lives here?" he asked, turning his attention to Charles and Margaret. "We both do," Margaret answered smoothly, stepping forward. "This is our home." Charles shot her a look, disbelief and frustration bubbling beneath the surface. He knew she was controlling the situation, carefully managing every word to keep herself in the clear. She was calm, cooperative, everything he wasn't at that moment, and the officers noticed. "And the deceased?" the first officer asked. "Who is she?" Margaret's gaze flicked briefly to Jenny's lifeless body before returning to the officer. "Her name is Jenny. She was close to my husband," she said, her voice soft but deliberate. "A little too close, if you understand." The officer's expression shifted slightly, just enough to show that he did indeed understand. The implication was clear, and Charles felt the noose tightening further around his neck. "You son of a—" Charles began, his voice rising with anger. But the second officer cut him off. "Sir, I need you to calm down," the officer warned, his hand resting on his belt. "We're going to figure this out, but we need you to cooperate." Charles clenched his fists, his heart pounding. He could feel the walls closing in, trapping him in a story he had no control over. He wanted to scream the truth, to lay it all bare, but the way Margaret stood there, calm, collected and untouchable, made him realize that it wouldn't matter. She had crafted this moment perfectly. The officer nodded toward the pantry. "We'll need statements from everyone, and you too," he added, gesturing toward Charles and Margaret. "We'll need to talk to you separately." Margaret inclined her head gracefully. "Of course, officer. We're happy to help however we can." Charles stared at her, disbelief washing over him in waves. "You did this," he whispered harshly. "You set me up." Margaret turned to him slowly, her eyes cold and distant. "The truth, Charles," she murmured. "It always comes out eventually." Her words hung in the air like a death sentence, and for the first time, Charles felt truly powerless. He had played the game, made his choices, lived his lies, and now the final move was Margaret's to make. The officers began ushering guests into separate rooms for questioning, and Charles knew with a sick certainty that every word Margaret spoke would be another nail in his coffin. She had planned this moment to perfection, and there was no escape from the trap she had set. As the officers led him away, Charles glanced back at Margaret one last time. She stood alone in the center of the room, untouched by the chaos she had unleashed, her expression serene. The nightmare was only just beginning. Charles sat at the kitchen table, his hands clenched tightly in his lap as the officers began their questioning. The weight of everything that had happened, Jenny's affair, the confrontation, the brutal discovery of her body, pressed down on him like a vice. One of the officers leaned forward, eyes sharp, pen poised over a notebook. "Tell us about your relationship with Jenny," the officer said, his voice measured and calm. Charles swallowed hard. He knew how dangerous this line of questioning was. "She was my nurse," he began carefully, his voice hoarse. "She took care of me after my surgery. That's all." The officer raised an eyebrow. "That's all?" We were told there was more to it than that. Charles glanced toward the doorway, where Margaret was being questioned in the next room. He could imagine exactly what she was telling them, every word a carefully crafted weapon designed to destroy him. "We got close," he admitted reluctantly. "It was a mistake. But I didn't hurt her." The officer's pen hovered over the page. "You had an affair?" Charles nodded, shame washing over him. Yes, but I swear I didn't kill her. The officer didn't respond immediately. He flipped back through his notes, eyes scanning the pages. When was the last time you saw her alive? Charles closed his eyes, thinking back to earlier that evening. At the party. She was fine then. And after the party, the officer pressed. Where were you when the body was found? I was in the living room, Charles answered quickly. I didn't even know she was in the pantry. The officer gave him a long, hard look. So you say, but right now, it doesn't look good for you, Charles. You admit to the affair, and now your mistress is dead, murdered, on your property. Charles shook his head violently. No, you've got it wrong. I didn't touch her. The officer leaned back slightly, exchanging a glance with his partner. They had heard denials like this before, too many times to count. Charles could feel their skepticism, the weight of suspicion settling on him like a second skin. Meanwhile, in the other room, Margaret sat poised and composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The officer questioning her scribbled notes as she spoke in measured tones, every word carefully chosen to frame the narrative exactly the way she wanted it. I knew about the affair, Margaret said softly, her gaze calm, but I chose not to confront them. I thought it was better to handle it privately. The officer nodded, jotting her words down. So what happened tonight? Did anything unusual happen at the party? Margaret gave a small, sad smile. I wanted to give Charles a chance to come clean, in front of everyone. I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd own up to what he had done. She sighed quietly, as if burdened by regret. But things didn't go as planned. The officer looked up. What do you mean by that? Margaret's smile faded, replaced by something colder. Jenny went missing during the party. I thought she had left, embarrassed by what I had revealed. But then, she was found in the pantry. The officer leaned in, sensing more beneath her words. Do you believe Charles could have done this? Margaret tilted her head slightly, as if considering the question. I don't know, she said finally, her voice soft but weighted with suggestion. He's been under a lot of stress lately, and their relationship wasn't easy. The officer scribbled furiously, every word adding another thread to the web. Back in the kitchen, Charles felt the walls closing in. The questions kept coming, and no matter how he answered, it only seemed to deepen the officer's suspicions. His mind raced, trying to figure out how things had gone so terribly wrong. Had Margaret killed Jenny, or had someone else? He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being framed, that Margaret had orchestrated every moment of the evening to look exactly like this. But why? Was revenge for the affair enough to push her this far? The officer's voice pulled him from his thoughts. We're going to need you to stay put for now, Charles, until we sort this out. Charles slumped back in his chair, defeated. He could see the way this was unfolding, step by step, and he felt powerless to stop it. Margaret's calm, deliberate presence was like a shadow over everything, her hand invisible but unmistakable in every piece of the puzzle. And the worst part was, he didn't know the truth himself. The house grew quieter as the officers separated the guests and continued their questioning, but Charles remained at the kitchen table, his thoughts swirling into chaos. Doubt gnawed at him, twisting his memory and clouding his sense of reality. He kept replaying the events in his mind, Jenny's hand on his arm, Margaret's cold smile, the moment everything fell apart. Somewhere in all of it, the truth was buried, but he couldn't see it clearly anymore. Then Margaret entered the room, her footsteps deliberate and slow. The officers allowed her a brief moment with Charles, perhaps assuming a private conversation between husband and wife might reveal something useful. Charles looked up at her, his heart pounding in his chest, fear and fury battling within him. "Why are you doing this, Margaret?" he whispered urgently, leaning forward in his chair. "You know I didn't kill her." Margaret's face was calm, infuriatingly composed, as she took a seat across from him. "Do I?" she asked softly, her voice so even it sent a chill down Charles's spine. Charles clenched his fists. "You set this up. You've been planning this, haven't you? This whole night. You wanted me to look guilty." Margaret regarded him with a cool expression, a subtle flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "I wanted you to see the truth, Charles," she whispered. "The truth about what happens when you betray someone who loved you." Charles's breath hitched, confusion clouding his thoughts. You think framing me for murder will make us even? Is that what this is?" Margaret leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice so that only he could hear. "This isn't about making us even. This is about consequences." Her words were slow, deliberate, like the toll of a bell marking the final hour. Charles felt his blood run cold. "Margaret," he rasped, desperation creeping into his voice. "Please, you know I didn't do this." Margaret's eyes held his, steady and unwavering. "And how do you know I didn't?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question hit Charles like a punch to the gut. For a moment, the world around him tilted, and he stared at her, his mind racing. Had she killed Jenny? Every moment of the night, her calm demeanor, her carefully chosen words, took on a new, sinister meaning. Was this all part of her plan from the start? "You," he whispered, horror dawning in his eyes. "You killed her." Margaret tilted her head slightly, her expression remaining perfectly composed. "Did I?" she asked again, the same question she had posed earlier. But now it carried a different weight, an almost playful malice beneath the surface. Charles could feel the walls of the trap closing in. Margaret's brilliance wasn't in the act itself, it was in the doubt she had sown. Whether or not she had killed Jenny no longer mattered. She had positioned the pieces so perfectly that no one, not even Charles, could be sure of what had really happened. The officers returned, cutting their private moment short. Margaret gave Charles a final lingering glance, her expression calm but devastatingly final, as if she were saying goodbye in a way words could never convey. She stood gracefully, smoothing the wrinkles from her dress, and turned toward the officers. "Let us know if you need anything more," she said coolly. "We'll cooperate however we can." Charles stared after her, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to scream, to expose her, to fight back. But how? How do you fight against someone who wields doubt like a weapon, someone who has already rewritten the narrative in everyone's minds? And then, in the stillness of that moment, he realized the truth wouldn't save him. It never had a chance. All that remained was Margaret's story, and it was flawless. Charles sat frozen, trapped in a fog of disbelief and horror. Margaret's mastery lay not just in the act, but in crafting a story so perfectly ambiguous that even he, the one closest to the truth, couldn't untangle it. The longer he sat with it, the clearer it became. He might never escape the web she had spun. The officers began wrapping up their initial questioning, gathering fragmented statements from guests, none of whom could offer clarity. Some guests recounted the shocking speech, others vaguely remembered Jenny leaving the living room. Margaret's calmness during the chaos was mentioned more than once, casting her as a composed victim, or something far more dangerous. The officer from earlier returned to Charles, his expression unreadable. "We're going to need you to come down to the station," he said. Charles felt the room tilt again. "What?" he croaked, disbelief clinging to his voice. "You think I—" "This is standard procedure," the officer interrupted. "We need a more detailed statement. You'll come with us voluntarily, or we can make it official." Margaret stood nearby, watching with silent detachment. Her presence radiated finality, as though everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Charles turned to her, his expression a mixture of fury, confusion, and desperate hope. "Margaret," he whispered, as if saying her name one last time would bring her back to him, to the life they had once shared. But Margaret's face remained cool and unreadable. There was no pity, no anger, just the cold absence of care. "Go with them, Charles," she said softly, as if it were a gentle suggestion rather than a death sentence. Charles felt the world around him shift. There was no pleading with her, no argument he could make to undo what had been set into motion. The narrative now belonged to Margaret, and everyone in the room knew it. The officers flanked him, guiding him toward the door. Each step he took felt like a nail being hammered into the coffin of his old life. The house that had once been his sanctuary now seemed distant, foreign, a monument to a life that no longer belonged to him. As they led him out into the night, the cold air hit his face like a slap, bringing with it the weight of everything that had transpired. The flashing lights of the police cars illuminated the dark street, casting long, jagged shadows across the front lawn. Margaret followed them to the threshold of the house, stopping just short of the door. She stood there, framed by the soft glow of the porch light, her expression serene, untouched by the chaos she had orchestrated. Charles turned to look at her one last time, his eyes filled with desperation, searching for some trace of the woman he had married. But she was gone, or perhaps he realized too late, this was who she had always been. "Margaret," he whispered one final time, but the name felt hollow, as though he was speaking to a ghost. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile, the kind you give when a game has reached its inevitable conclusion. The checkmate was complete. The officers guided Charles into the back seat of the patrol car, the door closing with a heavy, final thud. As the car pulled away, he stared out the window, watching as the house and the life he once knew disappeared into the night. And Margaret? She stood on the porch, her face illuminated by the faint glow of the moon, watching him go with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had not just survived, but won. The night was silent again. The guests had gone, the lights dimmed, and in the stillness that followed, Margaret stood alone, the architect of a perfect betrayal, the curator of a story that could never be undone. Charles sat in the back of the patrol car, his mind spiraling into the abyss of helplessness. He knew the truth, that Margaret had orchestrated every moment of the evening, carefully and deliberately. But the weight of her narrative, the seamlessness of her execution, had erased the possibility of proving his innocence. He was trapped in her version of events, a prisoner to a story he could no longer control. As the car rolled through the dark streets, he slumped against the seat, realizing that everything, the affair, the lies, and now the murder, had led to this moment. It no longer mattered whether Margaret had killed Jenny with her own hands or merely created the perfect circumstances to destroy him. The outcome was the same. He was ruined, and Margaret had won. Back at the house, Margaret stood at the window, watching the police car disappear into the night. A long breath escaped her lips, one she had held for months. For her, this wasn't just about vengeance, it was about liberation. Charles had taken her trust and shattered it, thinking he could live two lives without consequence. Tonight, he had learned that even the most carefully concealed betrayals come with a cost. The house, now quiet and empty, seemed to exhale with her. She poured herself a final glass of wine, the weight of 45 years of marriage lifting off her shoulders. It wasn't joy she felt, not exactly. It was closure, a calm acceptance that some endings need not be tragic. They only need to be inevitable. She sat at the kitchen table, the same place where she and Charles had shared countless meals, arguments and silences. The house felt different now, lighter, quieter. The storm was over, and all that remained was peace. And in that moment, as the silence settled over her like a soft blanket, Margaret whispered the truth she had known all along, the truth she had learned through the betrayal, the lies, and the cold, calculated ending of their shared life. Betrayal doesn't just break hearts, it poisons souls. In the end, lies bury love, and the weight of hidden truths will crush even the strongest bonds. We all wear masks, but when they fall, what remains is who we truly are. Be careful what you betray. It might be the thing you can never reclaim. She lifted her glass, as if toasting the emptiness, the quiet, and the new life she had carved out of the wreckage of the old. And with a small, contented sip, she sealed the night in silence.